Welcome or welcome back to my script writing mini-series for video games. Today we'll be going through the basics of writing an interactive script between characters, looking at choice and consequence with branching outcomes. Hi, I'm Rhi and welcome to Dev Talk and Tea. As always, let's have a little spotlight on the brew. Today we are finishing off my Bird and Blend chocolate box that my wonderful friend Liz got me for my birthday this year. This is the red velvet tea and it is exceptionally pink in colour. I take it with milk. I'm not actually sure if you're meant to, but in my opinion it's my favourite tea from that chocolate box series, but all of them are so lovely. As always, if you have any tea recommendations, feel free to leave them below because I need a restock very soon, so anything is appreciated. When it comes to writing an interactive script, we're going to combine traditional script writing practices with game logic. Today, we will be looking at two template scripts. One for a conversation between two characters where the playable character has a selection of dialogue options to choose from without any consequence, and one where there is a conversation between the same characters, only this time the playable character does have consequences and a different outcome at the end depending on their choice. If you are new to script writing and haven't seen my first video in this mini-series on writing for cutscenes and cinematics, then I recommend you go watch that first, as we're going to be skipping some of the formatting already covered in that video. If you are already comfortable with standard script formatting, then you're good to go. And as in my previous video, we will be using free software for this tutorial with all templates used linked down below in the description for free to use and reference if needed. Let's begin. Just like scripting for cinematics, we will also need a brief. However, this time round, we may want to lean more into the technical goals we want to achieve. For instance, the first script we're looking at today is between the playable character and a shop NPC. We don't necessarily need to go in depth about the emotional goals of the scene, so instead, we will focus on the gameplay flow that needs to be achieved in this interaction. For the second, we will be looking at branching narrative and dialogue, so we'll want to outline the different outcome states in the brief, as well as the goals for the story and the characters. Let's start with brief 1. In this script, we want to achieve dialogue to introduce the shop NPC, returning dialogue when the player comes back to speak to the NPC after the first time, a way to access the wares through dialogue, an optional dialogue where the NPC tells the player about themselves, and dialogue to exit the conversation. With this in mind, let's jump into the logic and the script for our first interactive script. Alright, so welcome to script 1, where we're going to just focus on the really basic choices and options for a interactive dialogue. So, as I mentioned, we're not going to go through the same formatting as the previous script, so setting up how to format the headers, the actual dialogue themselves. So if you don't know about that, I do recommend heading back to my first video now, just so you understand the basic formatting. So we're going to add on to that right now. Previously, where we've spoken about adding descriptions and interior and exterior, we don't really need that in a dialogue script because it's not meant to be informing the creative vision, it's just meant to be informing the dialogue flow. So technically this exchange could take place anywhere within this map. So we're going to skip the descriptive text for now and we're going to focus on just the dialogue. But what we are going to put instead, as you can see here in this first line on first interact, is highlighting the particular options and how the dialogue gets triggered specifically. So in this instance, we have on first interact. So we're telling whoever's going to implement this here, or we're going to inform whoever reads this script, the next piece of dialogue will play on first interact with this particular NPC. So personally, I've just gone for all caps and bold. Some people like to format it using different colors or perhaps using different symbols, but for now we are just simply going to use a very basic capitalized and bold to outline the different options and the different triggers for the dialogue. So on first interact, and here we have this NPC we're calling Nolanor, and then we have the dialogue underneath, so just standard as we've already practiced in the previous video for cinematics. Nolanor says, "Ah yes, you must be looking for some wares. To help you with your mission, you may call me Nolanor. I have quite the selection for you to peruse." Now, this piece of dialogue very clearly is a first introduction, so that's why it's bespoke to the first time you're interacting. But what about times after this? Well, that's where we've got on return. So when a player perhaps exits out of speaking to Nolanor for the first time and they come back to browse their wares again, we want to probably play a different piece of dialogue on return, so we're not getting the same repetitive line, and also the NPC feels a lot more intuitive and realistic, so they're not repeating the same thing again and again. So on return, now Nolanor says, "Welcome back, friend," immediately injecting life into the character, making them feel actually sentient. So right now we've only got one line here for on return. However, typically you'll want a handful of these because we're expecting the player to ideally return to this particular NPC multiple times to come shop or sell their wares. So we have one here for the sake of demonstration, but I would recommend, as I would with a couple of these other options which we'll go into, to have multiple different choices for what the NPC could particularly say. So for now we have the one. Perhaps later on down the line you come back and you go, okay, let's add somewhere between 3 to 5 options because we're not in this map for very long. If this is a massive hub where the player is expected to come back to throughout their entire gaming experience, we may want to increase that to 10 or even more unique pieces of dialogue so it prevents it getting repetitive and it feels more alive. So let's move on to the next particular option. We have the open shop option. And basically what this is saying is somewhere where the player has interacted with this particular NPC, there will likely be an option, maybe in the UI, to select, "Let me see your wares," "Enter the shop," something to that extent, and we'll have Nolanor say a line just to signify that that player has selected this particular piece of UI or opened up the shop. Similarly, we'll probably want to do way more than just this one line. Again, we'd want to have a plethora of lines to make it not feel boring, so it's the same kind of logic as the line previously. Again, very similarly, we're going to write a line for when a player buys an item. This kind of line, "A fine deal," could get very annoying very quickly if the player is buying a lot of things in that shop. So we again want to have a lot of different variation, but maybe later down the line consider that these lines don't play every time. So we call this a pool of lines. So any particular instance where an option that you select or maybe an interaction with an NPC has multiple lines, we will refer to that as a pool of lines, which we'll get more into in the next video on barks. But essentially the logic behind it is that every time the player selects this option, so in this case buying an item, the tech behind it, the code behind it, will say, okay, we've selected this, we've bought an item, therefore play a line from this particular pool of lines. So the item bought line category with all these multiple lines, it will select one of these lines, maybe "A fine deal," and choose to play it. We will go into more logic stuff in the next video, but that is just a very brief introduction to how these sort of lines typically work. So now we get into something a bit more conversational. So the last option, or sorry, the second to last option, "Tell me about yourself." This is going to open up a small dialogue that Nolanor kind of gives a small monologue here, telling the player about themselves and their backstory. So Nolanor says, "Me, I'm quite flattered. I've been here in Eliongalis my entire life." Again, as we stated in the first video, any sort of strange or unique words, like the made-up fictional place of Eliongalis, you may want to add a comment to add a pronunciation recommendation so that actors and directors and everybody else can understand how this word is meant to be pronounced. Carrying on, Sun Elves aren't permitted to leave after, well, never mind about that. But I do enjoy my life here. You city dwellers might find it a touch whimsical, but there's nowhere else I'd rather be. And that's it. It's just one line played after the other instead of sort of if there's multiple lines in these three, for instance, these three particular interactions, there might be multiple lines but only one plays. Here, this is a full conversation where all three lines play. And lastly, you probably want a line on exit. So when the player clicks exit or backs out, Nolanor may say a line that signifies the player has removed themselves from that interaction. Nolanor says, "Until next time." So, this is a very basic interactive script. There aren't any consequences or branching narrative or consequential choices. There are a few choices that are probably here mainly through the UI, such as open shop, item bought, tell me about yourself, and then others like on first interact, on return, and on exit are fairly basic interact triggers rather than these specific bespoke options that we select. So, with that being said, let's head back to Camarilla, where we're going to brief on the next iteration of this script, where we're going to implement choice and consequence. Now that we understand how to format some basic logic in scripting, let's take it up a gear and do a more complex script. This will be our branching dialogue script with multiple endings. We're going to focus on two different ways to end the script between our playable character and an NPC, with different dialogue options to choose from. Once again, we should start with a brief. In this script, we want to achieve the same as the previous script, only this time we want to add choice and consequences. So with that in mind, if the optional dialogue is selected, the player gets a choice to respond to. The player can respond negatively and positively. If the player chooses to respond positively, they get an item as well as affinity increase to that NPC. But if they respond dismissively, they receive affinity decrease to that NPC. Basically, does that NPC like them or not, and maybe get a sweet object to boot if they do. Let's hop into Interactive Script 2. Alright, welcome to Script 2, and just quickly looking at this, you may not see much difference until we get to the bottom of this script. Well, that's because nothing has really changed, but what we are going to do is, in this section here, when we say, tell me about yourself, after this small monologue that Nolanor gives, we're going to present the player with a conversational choice. So let's scroll down a little bit more just so we can start seeing this open up. So before we go into the actual dialogue that Nolanor says, we're going to have a little look at how we're formatting on a script, how to highlight, or some good practices on how to easily highlight these different choices. First of all, after the tell me about yourself, Nolanor has his usual spiel that we've spoken about already. Straight afterwards, we're going to highlight choice. Again, you may want to put this at a different color, you may want to add, I don't know, a hash to it, an asterisk, or something that highlights that this is a choice piece of dialogue. But just for simplicity in today, we're going to keep this uniform with the other way that we formatted the previous stuff, and just bold and capitalize and add a colon saying this is now going to be a choice for the player. Directly underneath though, we have a couple of different things. So first of all, you can see that we have brackets 1, why aren't elves permitted to leave? And we've color coded that purple. So the reason why we put number 1 at the beginning is because we're signifying here that this is option 1 that the player can choose. If we scroll further down here, we can see that we have option 2. The player has 2 options on this particular choice. You might be thinking, well, Rian, if this is option 1 up here, why on earth is option 2 down there? And that's down to flow. Because what's going to happen here is we want to follow option 1 all the way through its natural progression all the way down here until we get to a final destination, as you will, for this particular option. Then, oh, it's a little bit more down here as well. Then we are going to have option 2 after that. So reason why we don't want to just put 1 and 2 next to each other, because it will be a bit sporadic and then we kind of stop the flow. So let's have a look at this flow so you can understand why we want to keep this as one big flow and number 1 wants to be its own option before we go to number 2. So let's look at this. Number 1, why aren't elves permitted to leave? The player selects this option and Nolanor says, oh, you see, Lady Cecimaria was betrayed 80 years ago by her betrothed. I'm not sure what he did exactly, but it was dire enough for us to cut ourselves off from the outside world. Now from this, we get given choices again. So this number 1 choice opens up a second set of choices here, and we have highlighted these 2 in red just to make sure it's visually clear that it's not these initial choices, but these are sub-choices. And to also signify this, I've added 1.1 here and 1.2 here. So 1 meaning that we're carrying on from this number 1 option, and then this is just 1.1 option, 1.2 option. So we have 2 different options within within 1. I hope that makes sense. So we have 1.1, it must have been hard on everyone. So if you select that option, then Nolanor says, yes, it was. Not long after that, our lady's father passed, and my apologies. This is all rather bleak, though I appreciate you listening. Here, take this for your trouble. And then we have, again, for consistency and for ease in this particular tutorial, we have just in bold and in all caps, player gains health potion, Nolanor affinity +1. As with everything else mentioned, you may want to make this a specific color. You may want to add a specific symbol in front of it just to highlight that these are script options that give the player something, or that the infinity has increased or decreased. It's completely up to you, but just for the sake of this tutorial, we're keeping it nice and sweet and simple. So this in itself, from all the way 1 up into affinity +1, is a fully realized flow. So now it's going to get a little bit messy, but in a controlled chaos way. So bear with me. So instead of going to option 2, like I said, we're going to finish off all these options within option 1 and jump to option 1.2. Sounds dumb. So here, instead of us selecting 1.1, we're selecting option 1.2. So imagine you have a UI screen after this option 1 here that has these 2 options. It must have been hard on everyone and sounds dumb. And you have to choose between one or the other. And on this occasion, we're now going on to the second option. Sounds dumb. And Nolanor says, oh, well, I shall speak no more of it. And his affinity decreases by 1. So that in its entirety is a full flow with this option. Selecting option 1 will take you on this whole journey. And then we have option 2. Sorry, but I can't talk right now. Nolanor says, of course, my apologies. I'll be here if you wish to talk another time. And then that's it, that's the end. And then we go to the on exit line until next time. Oh, okay. So some of you probably clicked with that. Another part of you, I would imagine, would not have clicked with that. And it's a little bit wibbly wobbly because I'll be honest, on a traditional script format, choices aren't the most sexy to look at. Everybody has their own unique way of dealing with how to format them. This is one way to format them. Other kinds of formatting can be done depending on how you prefer to write, how your team prefer to work, etc., etc., or even the kind of engine or tool sets that you're using to implement dialogue. So this is just one instance of how we can lay out a choice and consequence in a traditional script format. So now that we've introduced all of that to you, let's go back to Video Rian and we will wrap up today's video. So, now you know the basics of writing an interactive script with choice and consequence. Of course, from here you can make it as complex as you'd like, introducing long-term branching options, triggering unique gameplay moments, creating romance arcs. There really isn't much you can't do. The next and final part of this 3-part mini-series will be on how to write barks, and we'll be looking at how best to set them up ready to be implemented in Engine. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and like game dev or general nerdy content, then feel free to check out my other uploads on this channel or on my socials. But hopefully I will see you next time. Bye!